Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our last Medtronics research seminar with Professor Katan Savla. He's an associate professor of civil engineering over at the USC Viterbi School. We're so excited to have you. And as always, the presentation will be recorded and put on the Medtronics website for your viewing after we're done. And we're going to hold questions until the end. Thank you.
All right. So it's nice to be back here. Last time I gave this seminar was maybe 2 or 3 years ago before COVID. So it's nice to be back here. I know the custom is to hold on the questions until the last minute, but given that we might not have the full time for what I intended to present, I wouldn't mind if you stop me in between and ask questions, especially if they require some clarification, right? So I understand a lot of you are not from engineering. So I do not want to lose you in slide 5 or 6. I would rather not finish all the slides, but have you guys with me as far as I can possibly can. So as the title says, what I would like to present is our work on traffic flow control, which is operation management of traffic, if you will. But the keyword here is microscopic, right? So what that means is controlling or managing traffic at the level of the vehicle. Right? So that's what microscopic means, as opposed to macroscopic, where you may want to optimize traffic at the average level, at the flow level, for instance, right? So there are various forms of microscopic control. The most popular, fancy ones that you see are the autonomous vehicles, right? You can think of that as microscopic control. So that is not what this talk is about. What this talk is about is complementary to that, right? So we are not going to touch the onboard controller of the vehicles, but the question is, how can the infrastructure manage the movement of vehicles, right? Manage the space that the vehicles have around them to move so as to optimize the overall system performance. That's what really this talk is about. And I want to acknowledge the help of the work of my student, Milad here, who I'm highlighting in bold here. And honestly, I'm just the spokesperson here for all the nice work that he has done. And also this is joint work with my colleague, Professor Petros Vano, also at Viterbi. And I want to use this opportunity to thank Medtronics for funding some of this work. So again, to be more specific, what we are interested in is RAM metering algorithms, right? So for this crowd, I'm guessing most of you, if not all of you, have driven around LA, you know what RAM is, right? Now, I would like to argue that RAM metering is one aspect of traffic control, but already there is a mechanism to do things at the microscopic level, as opposed to other things. We already have the infrastructure. The reason why I say that is because if you look at a typical RAM meter, right? So you see things like this here, which says 1 vehicle per green, right? Or 2 vehicles per green. That is nothing but a form of microscopic control, because you're really controlling the release and the timing of every vehicle to join the freeway, right? So the question that we're going to ask is, if we already have such a mechanism in place for years, for decades now, to be able to control the movement, at least at the boundary of a freeway, at the microscopic level, algorithmically, are we doing things the best we can in terms of the timing of when to release the vehicle in the freeway, right? So ideally, most of the algorithms, the way they work right now, they operate in a very localized manner. Meaning, what they do is they monitor the local congestion and they tune their release rate in response to the local congestion level, right? Clearly, if there was the ability to coordinate the timings of different ramps across the network, you could be more efficient. Right. So the central thesis of this work is that given that we anticipate having ability for vehicles to communicate with the infrastructure in the future, and also the infrastructure to communicate with each other, how can we leverage that to improve the efficiency of infrastructure, right? So rather than investing in expanding freeways, etc., how can we make our algorithms more better, right? To improve the capacity, travel time, and all of that stuff, right? So the key message that I want to give here is, and so we want to do that in the context of some specific performance metric, okay? If you think of traffic performance metrics, the ones that usually we tend to think of are travel time, obviously, or energy consumption, right? Now, what I would like to argue in the next 2 slides is that there is an even more fundamental metric, which is often overlooked, right? And that is the notion of of capacity or throughput, or what we like to call as the saturation limit. Okay, so in order to kind of start explaining what that concept is, I'd like to kind of include this definition from the traffic capacity, about traffic capacity from the highway capacity manual, right? So what this definition says is, defines what the capacity is for a given section of a roadway, right? So it says that, essentially what it says that in an ideal condition, what that means is if there is no queue backup in the upstream or the downstream part of that segment of the road, what is the maximum rate at which vehicles can flow, right? So this would, for example, if it's a 3-second rule, then this would be roughly correspond, if the cars are maintained 3-second distance between them, this would roughly correspond to 1,200 vehicles per hour, right? So this is the definition of what is the capacity at the really local level, right? What that means is that if the demand upstream is more than this capacity, then there's going to be queue buildup, right? So that concept has been in existence forever. I mean, I teach this in my undergraduate class, etc. Now, the question is this concept well studied or well understood when we go from very local notion of traffic to a system level performance metric, right? So think of your traffic network like a complex network with multiple ramps, on-ramps and off-ramps. And I want to come up with a definition of capacity of the network. What that means is that what is the maximum flow that my network can handle? Because that will determine for me how much demand can I let into the network. If my demand coming at the ramp is more than that capacity, then no matter what my algorithm does, there's going to be congestion, right? So I need to be able to understand what is the capacity of my network. And conventionally, people tend to associate capacity only with the physical space, right? If there is one lane, then the capacity is 1,200, 2 lanes, capacity is 2,400, etc., right? But I would like to argue that when we go at the network level, the capacity of the network depends not only on the physical space, but also depends upon what algorithm you're using, right? If your algorithms are very inefficient in letting the vehicles go, making inefficient usage of space, then your capacity will drop, right? And some other complexities also play a role, right? So what I want to do is present to you today is understand how the notion of network capacity depends upon the RAM metering algorithm, and how can I design my algorithm so that they improve or maximize the capacity as much as we can. Okay, so that is really the key focus of this work. And what I'm going to also kind of argue with you is that once you improve the capacity, once you design an algorithm so that the capacity is as much as it can be, then it will have a highly magnifying effect on decreasing travel times, as I will argue in a slide or two, right? So in that sense, the notion of capacity is even more fundamental than travel time. Okay, so there are some obvious limitations on how much a capacity could be, right? So your capacity cannot be infinite, right? Because if nothing else, there are speed limits, right? And vehicles have to maintain certain spacing in between them for safety purposes, right? And I would not go through the details, but if you take some standard engineering, like basic traffic engineering class, they will teach you how much space should the vehicles maintain between each other on the main line if they are to be safe, right? What that means is they consider some kind of a worst case scenario, right? So if you think of two vehicles, I and I plus one, let's say, the worst case scenario would be that one of possible scenarios under which you want to design the spacing is, let's say this vehicle comes to a dead stop, right? And the vehicle behind it can decelerate only at a certain maximum rate, right? If that is the case, then how much spacing should they maintain at speed limit, let's say, so that if the worst case scenario happens to I plus one, vehicle I, upon recognizing that it has to brake, it will not collide with this vehicle, right? So those considerations determine how much space they have to maintain between each other when they're traveling at a certain speed, right? So there are simple calculations. Naturally, that depends upon what is the speed at which we want them to be moving and what is the acceleration we would allow for the following vehicle, right? So the more the acceleration we allow for the or deceleration we allow for the following vehicle, you want to maintain smaller spacing. You can have smaller spacing because you'll be able to brake very quickly, right? But for the purpose of this talk, let's say there's a desired time gap that we have to maintain between the vehicles at the speed. Let's say the speed limit is 65 miles per hour. And let's say going to this or similar calculations, we know that in order to be safe, you need to maintain a 3-second gap, right? So the gap could be either in terms of distance or it could be in terms of time, right? So I think most of us are familiar with the notion of 3-second rule, right? So think of tau being 3 seconds here, right? So this is going to fundamentally limit the maximum flow that I can achieve, right? If this decreases, right, my flow increases, right? If I can pack vehicles more closer to each other, I can increase the flow. So this fundamentally will limit how much capacity I can have. And this comes from safety considerations, right? So, but this was about the safety consideration when vehicles are following each other at the main line, okay? But we also need to look at the safety considerations when the vehicles will be merging, right? So imagine there is consider this scenario where this ramp needs to decide an optimal time for this green vehicle to join the main line, okay? Ideally, let's say these two vehicles are traveling at the speed limit. Okay, and ideally what this ramp would like to do is release a vehicle at a time so that once it reaches the main line, it is exactly in between these two vehicles, because if that's the case, then the distance between the green vehicle and the orange vehicle, both front and back, will be exactly tau, right? So this is how it will play out, right? So this would be the case when this would be a possible scenario when what this scenario says is that if this ramp is long enough, let's say, so that the vehicle has enough time once it's released by the ramp to achieve the speed limit by the time it reaches the main line, then an initial gap of 2 times 3 seconds is enough for this ramp to release the vehicle. Okay? So again, the key here is that this ramp needs to be long enough for this vehicle to achieve that speed. Okay? If the ramp is not long enough, what do you think this gap should be? Should it be more or should it be less? It should be more, right? Because then what you need to look out for is a bigger gap, right? So let's say this ramp is short. What that means is this vehicle cannot by the time, even if it starts from rest and the full acceleration, by the time it reaches the main line, it's not going to achieve its speed limit, right? In that case, what's going to happen is once this vehicle joins the main line, at this instant, this vehicle is traveling at the speed limit, this vehicle is traveling at the speed limit, but this one is not, right? So either you maintain a big gap, or if the gap is not big enough, then the behind rear vehicle will have to slow down because this vehicle is not at the speed limit, right? So either way, no matter how you want to accommodate this green vehicle in the low Earth scenario, there will be some implications on the capacity, right? Because this is the best you can have, right? This is the best because here you are looking for a very small gap to release a vehicle. Here you would be looking at a bigger gap to release a vehicle, right? Because you need like a gap of 3 times tau. Here you need a gap of 2 times tau, right? So clearly the chances of getting a bigger gap are smaller than the chance of seeing a smaller gap, and therefore the rate at which you'll be releasing the green vehicle will be much slower in this case, right? So what this means is that at ramps which are small, where the ramp length is small, okay, there will be some kind of loss or drop in capacity. Okay, so one could think of this as some kind of a capacity drop phenomenon, if you want. Okay, now capacity drop is a complex phenomenon. It involves what that means is near the merge, because of the merging vehicles, there's a drop in capacity, right? So if there was no merge here, the vehicles could be traveling at this like with a gap of tau, right? But because when there are short ramps, you have to maintain much bigger speed, right? So what is happening here is, in some sense, this is inefficient, right? It's inefficient because you could have another vehicle here, but you cannot if you want to maintain safety, right? So this is an indication of capacity drop, right? So short ramps are inevitably going to lead in some kind of drop in capacity, and a ramp has to, whatever definition I come up with for network capacity, has to include that aspect. So this is what I mean by geometry, right? So geometry means how big of a ramp do I have, do the vehicles have before it can join the main line. So think of Pasadena, for instance, where the ramps are really small, right? Whereas somewhere around here, in fact, Figueroa, I think it's a huge ramp, right? So when you have long ramps, okay, now of course, even when you have long ramps, you may not be able to achieve the speed limit by the time you reach the freeway if there is a congestion on the ramp, right? And again, that in turn depends on what the ramp meter is doing. If the ramp was careful enough in releasing the vehicles, it would not lead to congestion on the ramp, and then the vehicles will be able to achieve the speed limit, right? So And that's what you want to do. So ramp will, the algorithms that you design for selecting the timing of the vehicle will be chosen so that they will look for the appropriate gap in the traffic stream so that you do not disturb the traffic stream. At the same time, you also do not create unnecessary congestion on the ramp. Okay. Now, I want to now start formally coming up with a definition of network capacity, right? And so for that, I need to describe a demand model. Remember, what I'm looking for at a conceptual level is how much demand can I ingest into my freeway network so that I can make sure that the queues that are on the on-ramp do not become untracked, right? So what is that maximum limit? That's really what I mean by network capacity or network saturation limit. So the way we are going to, the model for demand that we're going to use is we're going to say, if there are M, so I'm going to consider, let's say, road geometry like this, right? In this case, I have 3 on-ramps and 3 off-ramps. And I'm going to assume that I have control over all the ramps, okay? Meaning I can control in a centralized manner by coordinating the timings. And there are demands in terms of how much average number of vehicles are arriving at the ramp. Okay, so these are those numbers, okay? But then the vehicles at a given ramp, some of them may want to take exit from the next off-ramp, some of them may want to exit from a different off-ramp, etc. And you could capture that aspect of demand in terms of a matrix which is similar to the origin-destination matrix, right? So think of the on-ramps being the origin and the off-ramps being the destinations, right? So knowing what is the rate at which vehicles are arriving as a demand at different on-ramps, coupled with what fraction of this demand wants to use a different off-ramp, completely specifies to me the demand, the boundary, the demand that's arriving at the boundary, right? And what I want to come up with a definition is what's the max, so what kind of lambda and R can I handle, can my network handle? That is what will be the network capacity, okay? So again, so in this case, I have 3 on-ramps and 3 off-ramps. My lambda will be consisting of 3 numbers, lambda 1, lambda 2, lambda 3, where lambda 1 is the demand in terms of vehicle per hour that's arriving at ramp 1, similarly lambda 2 and lambda 3. And this matrix will tell me what fraction of this demand wants to exit from ramp 1 versus ramp 2 versus ramp 3, right? And so given a certain network, I want to be able to say what set of demands can I handle? What is the maximum set of demands I can handle? Right, that will be the definition of my network capacity. Okay, and the argument that I'm going to make is that maximum limit will depends upon the space, number of lanes, etc. But it also depends on how careful you are in designing the algorithm. Right, if your algorithm is poorly designed, then your network will become saturated even for small values of lambda. Okay. And by the way, I mean, in this talk, I'll go back and forth between a road geometry like this, which is, I guess, what we are more used to, versus geometry like this, which would be representative of freeway networks that we sometimes see in Europe or in China, for instance, that you have this kind of circular kind of freeway with on-ramps and off-ramps, right? So what I'm going to present today is agnostic to this kind of structures. But this kind of helps to visualize like a complete network. Whereas I guess this has a start and an end, so you maybe this is not so easy to understand how can you control an entire network, entire freeway from start to end, right? But the geometry doesn't really play a role in terms of what kind of network structure we have. Okay, so I'm going to go through a calculation now as an example to explain to you this notion of network capacity. Okay, so let's take the same network that I have before, and let's say I fix my this matrix R. What this means is, so let's look at the first row, and I'm going to let me explain that, right? So the way this number 0.8 means is that what fraction of demand that's coming from ramp 1, because I'm talking about row 1, okay? What fraction of that wants to use the segment downstream of ramp 2, okay? So this is row 1, column 2. What that means is what fraction of demand coming from ramp 1 wants to use the segment downstream of ramp 2. What that means is the remaining fraction, which is 0.2, will exit from ramp 1. Okay, so this is the kind of the demand, right? And 0.1 means 0.1 fraction of demand that's coming from ramp 1 still wants to use this particular segment because it wants to exit from here. Okay. So if this number will be confusing, again, this was a quick example to explain how to quickly capture in terms of simple numbers what fraction of vehicles joining from different on-ramps want to exit from different off-ramps, right? So that's what this number specifies. Okay. Now, I want to come up with a notion of what is the max. So if this is the kind of fractions, then I want to now understand what is the maximum flow that can arrive at different on-ramps so that my network remains stable, right, or remains undersaturated. So let's see if this is lambda 1 is the demand arriving at ramp 1 and there's no other demand, then the demand induced on this segment is going to be lambda 1 because that's the only demand that it is seeing, right? Now, according to this number, 0.2 of that will leave, okay, and the remaining 0.8 will continue. So that's this one, but it will be joined by lambda 2 coming from here. So this will be the kind of the induced demand on this segment, okay, and you can keep doing like that. Now, clearly, every section of this freeway has a capacity, which is the usual notion of capacity that we are familiar with, like 1,500, 1,600 vehicles per hour, right? So these three numbers are nothing but the demand induced on different segments. If this is the demand coming at different ramps, then this would be the demands induced on different segments of the freeway, right? So only those values of lambda 1, lambda 2, and lambda 3 could be handled by the network if each of these numbers is less than the capacity, the local capacity, right? Because again, the maximum demand that can be handled by this section will be the saturation flow, similarly here. And that's what I'm denoting by 1 over tau. So if you remember, tau was the time headway that the vehicles have to maintain. The inverse of that is the capacity, right? So each one of these quantity has to be less than or equal to 1 over tau. That defines to me, that specifies to me the combinations of lambda 1 and lambda 2 and lambda 3 that can be tolerated by my system. Okay, so what I have is I need to put lambda 1 less than or equal to 1 over tau. Let's say 1 over tau is 1200. Okay, lambda 1 needs to be less than 200 vehicles per hour. 0.8 lambda 1 plus lambda 2 needs to be less than 200 vehicles per hour. And similarly here, all three need to be less than 200 vehicles per hour. That's it. That tells me the combinations of lambda 1 and lambda 2 and lambda 3 that can be handled by my system. Now, one can plot a graphical, right? So let's say I mean, I cannot, it's very hard to do a three-dimensional thing, lambda 1, lambda 2, and lambda 3. So let me fix lambda 1, okay, some value. And what that means is now, if I fix the demand that's coming here from the upstream, then this is the set of demands that my RAM 2 and RAM 3 can handle, no matter what algorithm I'm using here. Okay, so and these things come from this inequality. So I put each one of them less than or equal to 1 over tau, 100, right? So qualitatively, what that means is there's a natural trade-off between how much demand can be handled at RAM 3 versus RAM 2, right? If you want to handle a very large value of demand at RAM 3, then which is this point, then that means the demand at RAM 2 has to be 0, because we're all sharing space, right? If you need to handle a lot of demand coming from RAM 3, then you cannot tolerate a lot of demand coming from RAM 2, because at some point they're going to share the space, right? And the precise combination is exactly given by here. Okay? So this kind of figures explain to you the trade-off, right? And this is the notion of, so this set of lambdas is the network capacity. How much demand can my network handle? So if your demand was outside this gray area, okay, then no matter what algorithm you use, no matter what RAM metric algorithm you use, you will have a queue buildup at least at one of the ramps. That's what it means. Okay. So I showed this calculation for a simple example, but there is a way to generalize this calculation to any network with arbitrary number of ramps, et cetera, right? So, and you can write it a little bit more formally. And I mean, essentially, you do the same exercise, meaning for each segment, you go segment by segment and you see how much demand is induced on that segment. And then as long as the demand induced on each segment is less than the 1 over tau, then my demand will be handled, right? So that's what this really says. Okay. So this, again, the summary, what I'm saying here is that you give me a network, I can tell you what set of demands can be handled by that network, no matter what metering algorithm you use. Okay. Now, just because I have characterized this region, Does not mean that if my demand is, let's say here, inside the gray region, that any arbitrary diametering algorithm will be able to handle. Okay, so this is in some kind of an impossibility result. So if you're outside this, then no matter what algorithm you use, the demand is just too high. But just because you're inside does not necessarily mean that your diametering algorithm will be doing well. So for example, let's say consider the simplest diametering algorithm where it always gives red. Okay, just for the sake of mental exercise. What do you think will be the throughput or the capacity of an algorithm like that? 0. Right? Because it's not letting anybody in. Right? It's always giving red. Okay. And again, it's a hypothetical, it's a mental exercise, right? But just to drive home the point that even if there is a possibility of handling a certain demand, if your algorithm is not well designed, it may not be able to achieve that potential. Okay. So what I was saying is if consider the simplest case where algorithm just keeps red all the time, in which case the only demand it can handle is 0. That's it. Anything more than that will be built up because it's always red, right? So that's an extreme example, but a simple like extrapolation from that is even if it's inefficient, right, it may not be able to achieve all its potential here, right? And so we want to design an algorithm which can achieve all its potential here. This is the maximum potential that any algorithm will have. Okay. Okay. So I want to now quickly argue why this limit. So graphically, we want to design an algorithm for which this region is as big as possible, right? So that I can handle most of the demand. Now, what implication does that have on the usual metrics that we are familiar with, like travel time, for instance, right? And this quick chart will tell you that it has a very fundamental implications on what travel time are. So if you can maximize the capacity of your network, it has a non-trivial implications on travel time. And the simple curve that helps you to explain this is this travel time versus demand curve. Okay. So what this says is that, and this is a very robust observation that we have. This is something I teach in my traffic engineering class, etc. Right. So if your network has a certain capacity, okay, which I'm showing by this vertical line here, right? So the x-axis is the demand. Okay. On here, I'm showing the vertical line as the capacity, right? What that means is if your demand goes above this value, then there's going to be queue buildup, massive queue buildups, right? And essentially what that means is the travel time will just keep increasing. People will be stuck forever and all of that, or for a long time, right? But what happens before that is the most interesting part. So as your demand keeps increasing, and as it approaches the demand, it has this highly nonlinear growth in travel time. As you get very close to the saturation, and I think you guys can feel that based on experience, right? So when the traffic is very low, the marginal increase in travel time for extra increase in demand is not so much as compared to when you're very close to the capacity, right? So now if this is the current capacity, and as I try to argue that this line depends on the algorithm. So if I can use an algorithm by which I can push the capacity to the right. Now what that means is that let's say if my demand is here, before I applied my algorithm, my travel time was somewhere here, but then under my algorithm, because I push the capacity to the right, my travel time will be on this one for the same demand, right? So what this means is that by pushing the saturation limit to the right, meaning allowing more and more demand, you have a highly nonlinear, non-trivial decrease in travel time, okay, because of this nonlinear growth of travel time as you approach the capacity, right? So in this sense, improving the saturation limit or capacity is more fundamental than improving travel time, because if you improve the saturation limit, you will have a much higher improvement in travel time than when you go directly improvising the travel time. And I'll demonstrate this some by some simulations also. Okay. So I realize I'm not there in my presentation as I would have expected, but that's okay. The key was to make sure this concept of saturation limit is conveyed, because that's something that's kind of new. Okay. So what I want to do now is I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip some things and now get to the algorithm level, right? So what do algorithms look like, right? So the way the current algorithms work, for example, the diametering algorithm, they will monitor the flow level or the occupancy on loop detector sensors on the freeway. And if they're more than a certain value, they will slow down the release rate, right? So that's how they operate at a qualitative level, right? So they try to optimize the flow on the main line, some ideal value. right? So that's what they want to do. If the flow on the main line starts increasing beyond that, they start decreasing the flow that they are releasing, right? Now, what that means is there is always a priority on the flow that's coming from main line. There's no coordination between the ramp. So naturally, a ramp which is upstream has a higher preference under this protocol. Now, that's not fair, right? So what that means is that downstream ramps will always have to give in to the upstream flow under the current protocol, unless there's a coordination, right? Now, there are a few algorithms which do some kind of coordination, but largely, most of the algorithms are not coordinated. The ramps have to give in to the flow that's coming from the main. Okay? So what we are going to do is allow coordination, but also in multiple ways. So broadly speaking, our algorithms are going to look something like this. So number one, as I've said, we are going to allow communication between the vehicles and the ramps. Okay, so what are the vehicles going to communicate? The vehicles are going to communicate simple things like the position and the speed. Okay, and the way this ramp is going to use that information is to know how many vehicles are around my vicinity. What does the local congestion around me look like, right? If there are too many vehicles, I should perhaps slow down releasing the vehicles, right? Or if the vehicles are moving too slow, much slower than the speed limit, then I should also slow down, probably because there's some congestion downstream. That's why these vehicles are slowed down, right? So the ramp is going to use this information from the vehicles to adjust the release rate in a way that will become a little bit clear, okay? But even if, let's say, the vehicles are moving at high enough speed and there are not enough vehicles, right? It does not mean that the ramp will release a vehicle every time there is a gap. Because again, we want to be considerate to the ramps downstream. Because if we start releasing vehicles myopically or greedily, we may create problems for the downstream ramp, right? So we are going to add an extra filter as to when a ramp can release a vehicle. Right? We do not want to release. So first of all, we want to make sure upon release of vehicle, I do not add to the local congestion, right? But even if the locally things are looking fine, I do not want to be greedy. I want to add some extra layer of filter, right? And that is something that comes through coordination. So all the ramps are going to decide beforehand how much greedy are they going to be, right? And on the next slide or so, I'm going to explain how that coordination happens. Okay. So again, if I have to summarize, again, the way the parametric algorithms work is, first of all, they make sure they do not add to local congestion, okay? But they also are not greedy, and they somehow take into account what will be the implication of how fast I'm releasing on what's going to happen downstream, okay? So that is the key behind the algorithm. That is the secret sauce behind our algorithm then improving the overall network performance versus just local, right? Because it's by design, it's kind of being considerate of the other apps. Okay, so the way the coordination happens between the ramps is through a notion of a cycle. Okay, what that means is, so for those of you who do traffic signal control, you know what traffic signal control is, you know the concept of a cycle. But let me explain what this is, right? So the concept of a cycle means that all the vehicles, every ramp is going to beforehand, when I say beforehand, meaning before we start deploying this algorithm, is going to decide upon a certain cycle length. Let's say that cycle length, and usually that cycle length is a multiple of this 3-second rule that I was saying, right? So 3 seconds times 10, let's say the cycle length is 10. So every ramp is going to come, all the ramps are going to come to a consensus. When I say all the ramps, meaning the algorithms that are on the ramp, are going to come to consensus that I'm going to update something every 30 seconds. I'll tell you what that something is. Okay. So something is going to happen every 30 seconds. I need to explain to you that. And something will happen in between that 30 seconds. Right. So that's how this algorithm is structured. Okay. So in between those 30 seconds, what a ramp is going to do is every time it sees a safe gap, it's going to release a vehicle. But it will, over a 30-second, it's not going to release more vehicles than which are waiting at the start of the 30-second cycle. Let me repeat that, right? So when a typical 30-second cycle starts at a ramp sees how many vehicles are waiting right now. Let's say it's 5 or 6 vehicles, 5 vehicles, let's say, right? What that means is it's for the next 30 seconds, it's going to look for a safe gap. Every time there's a safe gap on the main line, it's going to release 1 vehicle. Okay. But even if there is plenty of space gap, it's not going to release more than 5 vehicles. Why 5? Because those were the number of vehicles that were waiting at the beginning of the cycle. Okay. Now, during that 30 cycle, if 5 more vehicles came and there is an empty gap, the ramp is not going to release it. And this is where a ramp is being considered for the downstream one, right? By not greedily using all the available space, it's allowing some space for the downstream ramp. So it's a nice balance that a ramp has to do, right? Because on one hand, it does not want to overload the downstream ramp, but at the same time, it does not want to keep its own vehicles waiting. And it turns out that these kind of rules turn out to be the right way to do things. Okay, so the parameter here is how frequently do you update, right? So I mentioned cycle length is 30 seconds. If you cut short that cycle length to, let's say, 10 seconds, what that means is every 10 seconds. So in my previous example, when our cycle length was 30 seconds, let's say in the first 10 seconds of the 30 second, I released 5 vehicles. Okay, and 5 more came in. But those 5 vehicles will have to wait for another 20 seconds because that's when their turn will come, right? So the longer the cycle length, in principle, vehicles might have to wait before it's done. If they arrive, if they just happen to be the bad luck when that is they arrive when the cycle was already in procession, right? So by choosing the cycle length, too small of a cycle length meaning a lot of updates. Too big of a cycle length means usually you have to kind of newly arrived vehicle have to wait for long before they can get it going, right? So we can play with this parameter of the cycle length. Okay, so that's the way the algorithm works at a conceptual level. Okay, and so this is what I mentioned, and so this is what it looks like, right? So and now the other thing again in all of this is what it means to be a safe gap. Remember, I kept saying that ramp will release when it's a safe gap. That safe gap depends on how big the ramp length is, right? So if the ramp length is small, as I argued in the beginning of my talk, it will have to look for a bigger gap, versus if the ramp length was big, it will have to look for a smaller gap, right? So all those calculations are taken into account here. So so here is an example which tells you, which really highlights why you might need coordination versus you may not need coordination, right? So when I say no coordination means just release every time you see a gap, okay? In a nutshell, that works if all the ramps are long, okay? And here is an example that kind of illustrates. So I'm going to argue why using this simple example, when a greedy policy, like you just take up space whenever it's available, versus coordinating, when a greedy policy may not do the best, right? So here is an example of 3 on-ramps, off-ramps. And let's say at all the ramps, vehicles arrive once every, so this means a vehicle arrives once every 6 seconds. So tau is 3. And so 2 tau is 6. So between every of this interval, there is 1 vehicle. That's what it means. Okay. So one vehicle arrives every 6 seconds at all the ramps. Okay. But let's say ramp 1 is long and ramp 2 is short. Okay. Now, because of the directionality, clearly, if there's any space here, ramp 1 gets preference. Every time it sees a gap, it's going to release a vehicle. Okay. And because a vehicle arrives once every 6 seconds, this is the way the vehicle spacing is going to look like once it releases, right? The spacing between them is 6 seconds. 6 seconds, 6 seconds, right? But what happens to ramp 2? Ramp 2 also has the same arrival, okay? It has arrival once every 6 seconds, but then it needs a bigger gap because it's a short ramp. So it needs a gap of 9 seconds as opposed to the 6 seconds. It needs a gap of 9 seconds because by the time, because it's a short ramp, it needs to allow enough space between the vehicles for the vehicle to merge. Now, when will it see a gap of 9 seconds here? Will it ever see a gap of 9 seconds? If ramp 1 kept releasing every time it saw a gap? No, because under a greedy policy, ramp 1 will only ensure the gap is 6 seconds. It will never ensure gap is 9 seconds. So which means ramp 2 will be completely starved of any space. Okay? So this is where a greedy policy will not work. You need some kind of coordination or else ramp 2 will never get to release safely. Okay? So yeah, in this case, so if ramp 2 was long, then it would need only 6 seconds, in which case it could join in this gap. But if the ramp 2 is small, it needs a bigger gap and there's no big gap. In that case, you need coordination Meaning ramp 1 has to slow down once in a while to allow some of ramp 2 to go. Okay, that's what coordination, that's what the algorithm that I presented achieves. So we are already at few minutes past. So there are. So I mentioned the general architecture of how our algorithm works, right? You can take this architecture and do some fine tuning, right? So for example, do you want to have a fixed cycle length like every 30 seconds? Or do you want that cycle length to change, because as I said, there are trade-offs, right? If you have a too big of a cycle length, then what that means is a lot of vehicles will have to wait until they are allowed to go, potentially, right? And if that's the case, then maybe you need the cycle length to change, to adapt traffic, right? So there are a lot of variations we can add to this general structure, and we have such algorithms. So what I want to do in the remaining time is present some simulation results, okay? So here is our main simulation outcome, and this was done by Milad on microscopic simulation. So what we're doing is one of the policies, what you're seeing on the x-axis. So we started our simulations. We had this circular kind of a freeway network with 3 on-ramps, off-ramps, and we chose certain demands arriving at the ramps, and we tested how does the travel time look like under our algorithm versus under an existing algorithm. An existing algorithm is the one in blue, right? And this is in some sense state of the art. So in fact, this is an algorithm that has been used in some places, actually in practice around the world. Okay. Now this algorithm, in some sense, it's not a fair comparison because this algorithm is local. It does not coordinate, does not allow coordination between the ramps, and therefore there's a natural priority of upstream ramps over downstream ramps. But also it does not necessarily include information from the vehicles. Okay, so it purely relies on loop detectors to operate. Whereas our policy, technically speaking, requires to know the speed and the position of the vehicles in the vicinity of the ramp, right? So it's not a fair comparison, but one way to think of this is what is the potential if you could add those capabilities, right? So that's the way to look at it. So what you're seeing here is if you do only local, if you pick a state-of-the-art algorithm, which only does things locally in terms of ramp metering and only uses loop detectors, then for high enough demand, the queues will just build up. So the travel time just keep increasing. This is like heavy traffic. Things are stuck. There are bottlenecks all over the network. That's what this represents, right? But for the same demand, I change the algorithm, okay? And what that means, I allow coordination between the ramps. And I also allow some extra information from the vehicles. If I allow that, then the travel time is much smaller, okay? And this is happening precisely because the saturation limit under our algorithm, which is orange, is bigger than the saturation limit under the blue algorithm. And if you recall that slide that I showed for things growing exponentially, if I push my saturation limit to the right, which is what is happening here, the travel time falls down substantially. And that is precisely what is happening here. Right? So this is yet again another illustration where by focusing on increasing the capacity of your network, you can dramatically reduce the travel time in high demand scenarios. Right? So that is the in terms of safety also. So we do not achieve this lower travel time at the expense of safety. So this plot shows that we are as safe as these other policies, right? Because clearly you can improve the travel time if you're not being safe. What that means is you can instead of following the 3-second rule, you just do the 1-second rule, right? Of course, in that case, you can pack more vehicles and have bigger travel time and all of that. What this shows is that again, if you compare this versus this, on the y-axis, you have time to collision, right? So you kind of do, if a vehicle was to stop, some vehicle was to stop, how would it take for the vehicle behind it to collide with it, right? So the bigger this value is the better the safety is, right? Because you want enough gap between the vehicles, right? So our policy has, like in terms of both the mean and the range, it's better than in particular, it's no worse than existing policy, which means without compromising safety, we are achieving better travel time performances. Okay, so. And finally, I would like to highlight this capacity drop phenomenon, right? So remember, I mentioned it's a well accepted phenomenon, well observed phenomenon that near the ramps, you especially if there's a short ramp, which is kind of merging into mainline traffic, then you see some drop in capacity because the main line has to accommodate this slowly merging traffic, right? So it's natural to wonder, so there's going to be some capacity drop. What that means is if there was no ramp, right? If there was no ramp merging in, if it was just mainline traffic, and this is the flow you would achieve because there's nothing to kind of obstruct you, to disturb you, right? But as soon as you add a merge, okay, the flow drops down. So it's worth asking, does it drop down worse under our policy or versus a, let's say, an existing policy, right? And because we are nicely coordinating, right? We look for the gap when releasing the vehicle. We do not release unless we are sure that it's not going to damage the traffic. We see a smaller drop, right? So the orange one is again under our policy, DRR. So the fact that this orange one is higher than the blue one means our capacity is higher. The flows near the ramps are higher under our, because again, we streamline, because we do not just release greedily, right? We kind of streamline when it's safe and all of that. So, and yet we are doing that without compromising the overall system performance, right? So because one might argue, well, you might be streamlining the traffic, but then you're holding back people, right? So that's not happening, right? So the travel time shows that the travel time is measured from the moment the vehicle arrives at the ramp to the moment it leaves the network, okay? All right, so I would like to conclude here with some key takeaways. So I hope the key message one of the key messages that I was trying to give was, it's worth looking at this performance metric of saturation limit. I mean, usually we are used to looking at travel time, but I would say that there's even more fundamental performance limit or saturation limit of a network, and if you increase that, then it will have a big impact on travel time. Right? What I showed to you was an example of that too, right? And we propose some algorithms which again differ from existing one in terms of allowing coordination between the ramps and also tapping into the more fine-tuned information from the vehicles to manage traffic much better, to manage flow much better, right? And again, as I said, if you improve the saturation limit, you will have travel time. So there are a lot of ongoing work that Milad is doing, right? So when you have low merge speed, things are very funky. I did not get a time to go through all of that, but there are many interesting phenomena that happen, which we are really trying to understand in a much better way. If you may have noticed, I assumed I did not explicitly say when the vehicles are waiting on the ramps, to what extent they start overflowing into the surface streets, right? So the way it currently works here is your ram metering algorithms holds the vehicles because it wants to maintain the flow on the main line. But as soon as those vehicles start overflowing on the surface street, it starts letting everybody go, right? So there is clearly a constraint on how much you can hold back, right? So, I mean, we were ignoring in some sense. You're allowing, there's no constraints on the surface streets are okay. I mean, they can suffer at the expense of the freeway. That's what we were assuming. But ideally, we would like to bring them together. What that means is coordinating the traffic signal and the ram meters, right? So the demand we assumed was exogenous, right? But after all, where is the demand coming from? It's typically coming because of traffic signals, right? And we want to do more comprehensive. So there are very nice simulators called VISIT, for instance, right? Which model the traffic dynamics very nicely. The simulations that I showed were on MATLAB, which is a little bit simple simulator. It does not capture the traffic physics very perfectly. So we want to do very comprehensive performance evaluation in this simulator, and Milad is doing that. For example, along multiple lanes, real traffic network like around here in LA. Want to look at other performance metric, energy consumption, etc. And to come with a comprehensive kind of suite of ram metering algorithms. So what we believe, based on what we have presented here, there's a lot of potential there. So I'll stop here, 101. So stop here.